we're gonna rock and roll. This week, we're gonna look at populations, how populations of species change. And there's a couple of really fun labs that we're just plain not able to do, but I'll talk about them, and I might try to find something online that can simulate them, but it's just not as fun as just counting out the little paper mice in class. Students historically have hated that lab, but I love it, but whatever. All right, so good for you. All right, so this is something we talked about last week, the keystone species, the otter. You know, it's a keystone species. It lives in kelp forest. I think we watched a little video on it last week. It eats sea urchins, and it became endangered in the 70s because it was hunted for its pelt, for its fur. And the ecosystem almost crashed. But in the past 30 years, 40 years, they've increased from 300 to nearly 3,000. And it helps protect the kelp forest, and the kelp forest off the coast of California are actually making a little bounce back. All right, so rock and roll. There we go. All right, so looking at population dynamics, how animal populations change. They can change in size, pretty easy to understand. How many you have, density. What are we talking about with density? Yeah. How many do you have in a certain amount of area? Age distribution. What can you tell from age distribution? Well, we'll get there in a second. That's more kind of where they are. What can you tell? But like, if I look at a population and I see a whole bunch of individuals in that population are old and not many are young, what can you tell me about that population? Not reproducing very fast. What else? They've been there for a long time. There's one more big one. Kind of goes along with what Matthew's saying. What? Maybe there's not enough resources. And what could you tell me about the future of that population? Yeah, something's happening where the population is about to crash. Flip side of that, if you have a whole bunch of young species and not very many old species, what's about to happen? Your population is about to boom, about to really grow. Okay. Some other things, they respond to their environment, they change according to their distribution. So this is just a couple of ways that populations can be distributed, clumps, very uniform things. Why would a population want to be uniform?
Materials from one spot.
Very good, absolutely. So you don't want to have bushes, for example, here on top of each other because they'll compete against each other. And so you have that uniform distribution to really just kind of allow for all of the species to be able to live and grow. Dandelions, though, on the other hand, kind of go everywhere random because there's enough resources for all of them to grow. What you do, who cares? Make sense? All right, so the variables that affect a population's growth. And in this picture, you'll see on a couple different slides, it's got a lot of information in it, but it's changing between the abiotic and biotic things that allow populations to grow. But it's pretty simple. You really only have 4 things. Births, which cause your population to grow. Deaths, down. Immigration with an I. But if someone immigrated with an I into this classroom, what did they do? They came in, we increase. Immigration with an E is exiting. That's the easiest way to remember. Immigration in, immigration exit. Okay? So immigration and births, we go up. Deaths and immigration, we go down. Okay? So pretty straightforward here. Population change equals birth plus immigration minus deaths plus immigration. So looking at some examples, I think the next slide makes this bigger. Nope, it doesn't. So we have growth factors and decrease factors. So growth factors, another way to think about it is biotic potential, stuff that allows your population to increase. Decrease factors is environmental resistance. What is the environment doing to stop your population from growing? So just looking down the list here of a couple of them. You have some abiotic things, more light, more life. Less light, less life. Pretty straightforward. Temperature is just favorable versus too high or too low. Environment, lots of nutrients versus too little. And then you have your biotic factors, your life factors. A generalized niche versus a specialized niche. What's that talking about?
They can survive in a wider range of environments versus having a very specific thing they have to have.
Very good, very good. Roaches got a generalized niche. They're gonna find something to eat, they're gonna be all right. Whereas the stinking rabbit that lives in my barn will only eat a very, very small amount of different things. I'm like, Angie's like, give it whatever, give it any type of vegetable. I slice up some squash, the rabbit's like, no. So it's, whatever. Specialized niches, obviously you're more likely to decrease. Looking at some other things. What ages are important to look at when you look at age structures? You have pre-reproductive age, reproductive age, and post-reproductive age. Pretty simple, concept, but incredibly important for looking at animal populations. Pre-reproductive age are organisms that are not mature enough to reproduce. Reproductive, capable of reproducing, and post-reproductive, too old to reproduce. Pretty straightforward deal, okay? Looking at limiting factors, anything that can limit the population's growth. We already kind of talked about a bunch of these. Not having the things you need to grow. Then you have your biotic things, competition from other species, things that eat you or things that hurt you. And then amensalism is where you have a symbiotic relationship where one thing is just plain hurt and the other thing is helped. And then mutualism where you need that other species. So that's what makes that a limiting factor. All right, just some vocabulary for this stuff. We already talked about that. Intrinsic rate of increase. This is the rate of population would grow if it had unlimited resources. Now, this is important. Now, what are the odds that that happens in an ecosystem? Yeah, I mean, you can't, the word unlimited doesn't exist in nature, okay? But this is important because it helps you to find the limiting factors. It helps you to find limiting factors because you can compare what intrinsic rate of increase would be, how this population would grow if it did have that, I thought you had stole my drink. Goodness gracious. Trying to be like me this morning. I was about to tell you it had sunflower seeds in it. You might not want to drink it. All right. Environmental resistance, we already talked about things that are slowing you down. Then we have carrying capacity. Now, the big letter K, you've talked about carrying capacity in biology class, but the big letter K is representative when you look at the biostatistics of what carrying capacity is. The maximum number of individuals given species that can be sustained indefinitely in a given space. So this little chart here is super cool and it helps us understand this. You're living at your intrinsic rate of increase. You have this exponential growth until something happens where you either run out of resources or you grow so much that predators start to notice you and start to decrease your population. But then we end up steadying at this rate here where you go kind of up and down and up and down. Why isn't it a flat line here for carrying capacity? Why does it go in a wave? Yeah, sorry, bud. Got to be able to see my children on the screen there.
When it goes over, they're targeted more. When it goes under, they're targeted less.
That's a great way to look at it. Absolutely. If the population gets too high, then the predators have a lot to eat. So the predators grow, then that drops the population. But in turn, that makes you just kind of get this kind of back and forth thing going on. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So looking at exponential growth versus logistic growth. Logistic growth is what we see in normal populations. You get this S-shaped curve. And I apologize for these two things being on the opposite, but logistic growth, you get this S-shaped curve where you end up growing exponentially, but then you hit that carrying capacity. You get that limiting force that slows you down. Exponential growth is what happens when you have few resources limitations. You get this growth at a very fixed rate. Now, does growth at a fixed rate mean the line is flat? I mean, you can pretty much tell right there. Does growth at a fixed rate mean the line is flat? Because usually you think growth at a fixed rate, you think like that, right? And the reason it's not like that is because it's not the population at a fixed rate, it's the growth at a fixed rate. If you took physics, you know all about this. It's the difference between velocity and acceleration. Okay, acceleration can be fixed, but velocity is going to be exponential. That makes sense? Okay, pretty straightforward deal. Y'all are smart enough to get this stuff. But just this is the same picture we saw a little bit ago. You have a population that grows exponentially until it hits that limiting factor. You get a little bit of overshoot, but then you crash back to normal and you end up at a carrying capacity. Now, what might happen? I know some people are kind of going to be glancing their eyes there. How about that to help you out a little bit? What might be going on here? This elk population, their carrying capacity is way down here. This is on an island, I believe. I think it comes up in a second here. But their population is way down here. And then you have your carrying capacity and you're around the carrying capacity, and then something changes where the population overshoots its carrying capacity. But then you get a crash. Well, what might happen there?
Not right now, but
Okay, maybe something killed their predators. You know, maybe their predators became endangered, or maybe something hunted their predators, or something got rid of their predators and then reintroduced them.
they were protected. They did protect.
Yeah, they could have been protected and then realized that, hey, we got too many of these, and they stopped the protection, maybe started back the hunts. You know, all kinds of reasons for that, but I like those two ideas. Good job. Right, so I knew this was coming up big again, but we kind of already talked about most of this. Looking at population density effects. Now, I've never been a huge fan of these terms, but these are terms that you will see when they start talking about ecology and environmental science. Density independent controls versus density dependent controls. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Does your density of your population matter for this control? The easiest way to think about it is density independent controls don't care about whether there are animals there or not. They're going to do their damage, they're going to do their thing, whether the animal's there or not, and having a different number of animals doesn't really matter, okay? The example I always use is if the hurricane comes and blows the tree down, it doesn't care whether there's one squirrel living in it or 20 birds living in it. So it's a density independent control because the damage happens to the ecosystem regardless of the amount of the population. Whereas density dependent controls, it matters how many you have. Competition, predation, parasitism. The more you got, the different the control is going to be. Same thing with infectious diseases. We see this in all animals, including humans. Where did you have the first COVID breakouts in the United States? Yeah, Los Angeles and New York, which are your two most population dense communities in the United States. Animals works the same way. You have a whole bunch of people piled on top of each other, a whole bunch of organisms piled on top of each other, you get your density dependent controls come into effect. Whereas your density independent controls doesn't matter. You know, it's independent of the population. This stuff still happens, and it can still affect you whether you have one individual or 100 individuals. I can roll. All right, looking at different population curves. This is a favorite for AP test questions. They like to compare the different populations. Most of the ones we already talked about are cyclic, especially your predator-prey relationships. Things that eat other carnivores and animals that get eaten by carnivores. Both end up in this cyclic curve because as one population goes up, then the other population comes up in an echo, and then once that one goes up, it makes the other one crash, which makes the other one crash, and blah, 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 blah. Okay? You can have these irregular curves, which, you know, maybe that it's something that has to do with the climate that's changing. And, you know, whether if it's a very unstable ecosystem or it's a small group that's really struggling to survive on the pioneer, the edges of a zone of tolerance, you might see this irregular thing. Top level predators sometimes will end up in this stable thing, or in plants, a lot of times we'll have a stable population curve, things that are living in a very, very secure ecosystem with nutrients and limiting factors that don't ever change could end up in this stable curve. And then you have things that have the eruptive curve. North Carolina has one on this eruptive curve that is really unique and a unique survival things that we got a lot of this summer. What insect did we have in North Carolina that lives on this curve right here? Mosquitoes, I would say, are probably more, depending on if you count eggs or larvae as individuals. If you count larvae as individuals, you probably are stable. If you only count adult mosquitoes, you're cyclic, because they come back in the summer and go away in the winter, come back in the summer, go away in the winter.
This year they don't see as bad as they did like 2 years ago.
And maybe it has to do with what I'm talking about, though, because I think that what I'm talking about might actually eat mosquitoes. Maybe I have to look that up. Cicadas.
Those the big giant bugs that are they go up this loud sounds.
Yeah,
The walls and stuff.
Yeah, they're really loud, like things that are, they come back. There's different species, there's different organisms, but they come back 15, 16, 17 years. They'll go dormant underground. Yeah. And then they come back. I think the one from this summer was 17 years. Every 17 years it comes back, and spent, and came out, lived this life for a week or so, had some babies, and went back, died. Okay, so eruptive cycles, some things do have that where they boom and bust.
Are still like a few every year, that kind of thing.
I think I'd have to look it up, but I think there's enough
this year.
I think there's definitely one that came back this year, but I think it's once every few years. I think there's 4 or 5 different species, and they come back on a different scale. All right, so this is kind of just some notes on what we just talked about. So examples there, you have undisturbed tropical rainforests are very stable because the ecosystem's not changing. Ecosystem's not changing, and you're maxing out your nutrient resources. Eruptive, where you have your cicadas, and you have your algae blooms can be eruptive, where the ecosystem changes and all of a sudden, poof, lots of algae come out. Cyclic, your lynx and your hare, where they're responding to each other. And then irregular, it just usually it's going to be a small population size on a very harsh ecosystem. Where
So like a new species that just like evolved from a different one, kind of follow regular patterns.
until it finds its way into another
It's
one.
looking for
Yeah.
its niche still. Like
Yeah, absolutely. Are places like harsh ecosystems like volcanic vents, or like even new rock created by volcanoes, or underwater hydrothermal vents and steam vents, and where you have these organisms living on the edge of possibility. So this is what I'm talking about with the cyclic cycles in response to each other. If you notice, when the hare goes up, the lynx goes up in response, but then they eat all the hair and it makes it crash. This is the lab that we do. The way we set up the lab is we use little tiny pieces of white paper that count as mice, and we count them out. Maybe start with 2 or 3 on a table, and you have a clear piece of plastic that counts as an owl. And you drop it from about 3 feet above the table, and whatever mice it lands on get eaten. Every mouse that survives makes another mouse, so they get to reproduce. And if the owl eats at least 2 or 3 mice, I can't remember, it also gets to reproduce. So you'll drop 2 owls in the next thing. And what you'll see is you end up having an explosion in mice because they're growing exponentially, and it's hard for the owl to eat them. But then once the table is full of 250 little slips of paper, the owls are just eating like crazy, and you have mousepocalypse. But then you have owlpocalypse because all the owls died because they ate all the mice. So they usually do that about 20 generations, and you see this cyclic cycle. That's redundant, I know. So yeah, another way to look at this is top-down control versus bottom-up control. Calm down. But top-down control is where the lynx is preying on the hares to reduce the hare population. So top-down control would be the predator is reducing the population of the prey. Bottom-up control is the prey is reducing the population or increasing the population of the predator. Both of these things, I don't really love these words because they're both happening at the same time. They're both being controlled, and it's just another way to look at the statistics. All right, just a real quick asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction review from biology class. What's the difference?
Sexual has two different beginnings, while asexual is more single reproduction. Like it just,
I think you said it backwards.
no, asexual, because sexual has to have two different sets of like DNA that mix together and makes a union with two different sex cells, and then asexual is just. one
Yeah. Okay. I thought you said it that way. You're good. What did you say, Matthew?
I was just saying asexual is from one year and then
Sure.
asexual is two.
Another way to think about asexual reproduction is cloning. You have one cell that splits into two cells, and both those cells are identical. You're right, Lauren. I didn't say you're wrong. Come on,
I
man.
didn't say you
Okay.
could.
And in sexual reproduction, you're going to take two different organisms, mix the genetics, and create a new organism with unique genetics. Okay. So we got, pros and cons. Why would you want asexual reproduction?
You don't have to depend on finding something else.
Don't have to find a mate. What's good about keeping your genetics the same?
You know it works.
You know it works. So when the Staphylococcus aureus bacteria shows up in your throat and it says, oh my goodness gracious, life is great here. Let me make a bunch of babies just like me. And you end up with, an infection. Okay. Strep pyogenes is strep throat. Crap, I went the wrong way. Staphylococcus is a different one. But Staphylococcus aureus is MRSA. Sorry, don't want to get that either. But bacteria love asexual reproduction because when they find that one sweet spot where they really are able to grow and live, they want their same genetics to go like crazy. And it's also why when you take antibiotics, which ones do you kill? Well, you kill only the bug is targeting for, but also you kill which ones of that species? All of them, because they're all the same. You with me? So taking antibiotics, killing bacteria with antibiotics, if you don't have a resistant one, which is a big if, is really easy and really effective because they're all the same. Make sense? It's a whole lot easier to kill bacteria with antibiotics than it is to kill bugs with pesticide. Because bugs are going to undergo sexual reproduction. So every bug is a little bit different genetically. And so you can try to, kill some, but you'll have some be able to survive. And then those that are able to survive, what are they going to do? They're going to reproduce and make more babies. And now next time you spray, what's going to happen? You're not going to be as effective. Make sense? So sexual reproduction's advantage is you change every time. You get different strategies. You can have more effective things, and it's easy. It's a better strategy if things aren't going great in a harsh ecosystem. Sexual reproduction is better. It gives you lots of genetic diversity. Disadvantage with sexual reproduction: only half your population is reproducing. You can have mutations. Things you can get better genes, but you're just as likely to get worse genes. And you have to, spend all this time and energy on courtship and mating and finding a mate and, dancing a dance. So next thing is R-selected species and K-selected species. I always have to look them up, but I have to remember. I gotta get a good way to remember it. I've never really come across a good way to remember it. But R-selected species make lots of babies, knowing that some of them are going to die. Classic example of R-selected species is the loggerhead turtle on the beach. Lays 70 eggs, and 70 little baby sea turtles come waddling out, and maybe one or two of them make it to adulthood. That is an R-selected species. The strategy is to make lots of babies, and then maybe one or two of them makes it to adulthood. Why is that an advantage? Why is that a good thing? It seems like dead babies is a sad thing. Why is this a good thing?
You know, overpopulated.
Only the strong survive. You don't overpopulate because you're making fragile babies. And you know the babies that do survive have those genetics to really rock and roll. Man.
I was just gonna say that like you don't have to spend the time like taking care of them because you make a bunch and then move on. Or
Little or no parental care or protection of the offspring. The loggerhead sea turtle comes up, lays the eggs, and rolls out. You know, the idea of the little baby turtle on the back of his daddy, like in Finding Nemo, where you got the what's the dude, you know, go with the flow, that type of thing. That's silly. Turtles don't have families. Turtles do for themselves, and oh well. Okay. Yeah, turtles are not good parents. They make lots of babies. They usually have a generalist niche, eat lots of different things, and they have a low ability to compete. These are early successional species. You're going to see these at the beginning of an ecosystem. So if you burn down the forest, these guys are going to come back first.
Is that what?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the whole joke about cockroaches surviving nuclear thing. I'm repeating you so everybody can hear. Okay.
well, so
Alright.
wouldn't they have a better time like expanding, like growing than like the other species just because like if they find a niche if they're not sure if they work, they're not going to try to offspring there and hope something sticks.
That's you just described fish. Like you just described what fish have done for the past 6 billion years. Fish. No wait, did I go too high? I went too high. 3 billion years. Sorry. That went twice too high. Sorry about it. But yeah, you just described what fish have been doing in the ocean for 3 billion years. Let me throw my eggs here and see what happens. Let me throw my eggs here and see what happens. Ooh, lots of babies. Let me throw my eggs here. That's why fish go and swim back to where they were born to spawn again. That's why they have that magnetic sense that they can. I mean, a tuna isn't like, you know what? I remember when I was in Chesapeake Bay. Let me go back to Chesapeake Bay. No. A fish just has this magnetic sense and says, I need to go here to mate. I need to go here to mate. Because it was successful for that fish. Does that make sense?
So wouldn't humans do similar things? I don't know.
Okay, let's talk about case-selected species.
I was going to say what they do the same thing, but they don't because we don't just have
Because it's a different strategy. It's a different strategy. Instead of having lots of babies and fingers crossed, some to get to adulthood, you have few babies, larger babies that are able to take care of themselves, and you take care of them. Much later reproductive age. You're talking about a few years to get to maturity, as opposed to these guys can make babies the day they're born, a lot of them. Okay? I mean, some insects and some, very, very small organisms are reproductive within a day, within hours of being born. And then they die. But then these guys later reproductive age, most offspring survive. You want your offspring to survive because you're not putting as much energy into making thousands of offspring. They're adapted to a much more stable climate, lower reproductive rate. These are usually specialists. Now, humans, I know you can make the argument, are generalists because they can live in lots of different environments, but that has more to do with the Homo sapien idea of being able to plan for the future. Humans strip away all of your planning, strip away your houses and your clothes and society. Humans are a specialist, or excuse me, a specialist niche, not a generalist niche. You put us out in Alaska with nothing, we're going to die. You put us in the desert with nothing, we're going to die. You put us in the African jungle with nothing, we might be able to figure it out. We are much more specialist than we like to let on. Now, we've inhabited the whole earth, but it's because of our culture and because of what makes us unique. And while we're talking about human populations separate from the rest of the animal populations, then it is because our closest relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, they're specialists. Yes, ma'am.
So, like, can't some selected species species do the same thing that are selected with, like, if their population gets super, super low?
You
Like,
mean-
is that possible?
You'd have to find an example.
Like,
This is usually a blanket strategy.
like you're one or the other, like you don't like go back.
Pretty much.
Because like, I mean, it's not the same thing necessarily, because like you said, humans are like selective or whatever. But like, before we had like modern medicine, so did people used to have like 10, 15 kids? because maybe
Absolutely,
3 or 4
absolutely. And which of those kids did you want to live?
At least,
The example, no, slow down, you gotta say something fun. So what she's saying is, were humans our selected species before modern medicine because you had 10, 15 kids, fingers crossed, a few of them lived. Now, I think that's a little,
like they're still trying to take care of them, and they like put effort into them because we have the ability to do that. But
you didn't have 10 or 15 kids because you were hoping, now stick with me, because you were hoping a few would live to adulthood. You had 10 or 15 kids because of a couple things. Number one, you had 10 or 15 kids over 10 or 15 years, not at one time. Number two, you had 10 or 15 kids to help your livelihood. The more kids you had, the more money you could make, the easier you could survive. And number three, there's no birth control.
well, okay, so, but it's still kind of the same concept of like having a bunch of kids, and it's something to
Still over here, a
No,
bunch.
I'm not saying that
a bunch.
it's not.
So, but here's another thing too. So if you look at R selected versus K selected, when I say fewer and when I say many, I'm not talking about 2 versus 10. I'm talking about 5 versus 5,000.
No, I know that. I'm just saying, like, it's not like, there's still K, like, people have always been K.
Sure.
I'm saying they follow, like, some of the ideology of R.
We'll talk about that more in a couple days when we talk about humans specifically. But you're on the right. I like the track you're going down, but it doesn't change that. Cool. And that's why I asked the question, which ones did you want to live? Because the answer we all should know is all. Okay. And that's another thing that makes humans different too. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, looking at survivorship curves, I think this might be a good stopping point. Looking at survivorship curves, these show the percentage of members in a population surviving different ages. You have those R selected species, those fish, those insects, loggerhead turtles that are early lost species. Make lots of babies. The most common time to die is as a baby. But if you survive to reproductive age, you're gonna make it. Flip side of that is humans and other K-selected species, but they're late lost species. They try to keep their babies alive, and then they don't die until after reproductive age, late loss. Then you have some species that are constant loss. Constant loss species are usually going to be species that are prey species that are getting eaten all the time. And so you end up with just this constant loss throughout the life cycle. It can be R selected, it can be K selected, it doesn't really matter. Usually these are things that are just going to get eaten throughout their lives. Small mammals, lizards, songbirds, rats, mice, they would all be in the constant loss category. Cool? Let's see if I almost stopped there. This might be a bad idea. Hold up. Oh yeah, I'm almost done. Let's finish. All right, so looking at human impacts real quick. We've already talked about most of these. Habitat degradation and fragmentation, splitting up habitats, things like that. Ecosystem simplification. This is huge. When you drive anywhere or walk anywhere where humans are, what we have done to the diversity of our ecosystem is completely ripped it apart and put back a monoculture. When you drive through a neighborhood, it's like, man, this is a really nice neighborhood. Look how pretty everything is. How many different species of grass is there usually? 1, maybe 2 if you got somebody fancy cutting Bermuda grass or something like that. If you drive by a golf course, maybe 3 because you have a different grass in the fairway, in the rough, and the green. But you're still talking about replacing diversity of the forest and deciduous forest and the swamp with the same thing because it's pleasing to the human eye. This is huge and something we don't talk about very much, and hopefully we'll get to talking about it here. Creating genetic resistance. You spray pesticides, the only pests that survive are the ones that are resistant to it. Eliminating predators. If you want to screw up an ecosystem, cheap and fast, where are you going to aim on the food web? At the top or the bottom? Where are you going to aim for destruction? Is it easier to burn down the woods or kill the eagles? The wood's going to bounce right back because there's so many things that you're going to miss. And there's so much of it. If you kill the eagles, where are the eagles at on the food web? At the top. Everything down below is going to be affected. Yeah, I know. If you can blow up the bottom of the food pyramid, yeah, you can blow the whole mess up because nothing's going to have anything to eat. But it takes way more energy to do that. You know, this is why we don't eat top-level predators. This is why you have hippies in California that are marching and will shut you down if you try to sell shark fin soup. Because where are sharks? This is why you have people going crazy over SeaWorld, because the SeaWorld's mascot is what type of whale? Where is it on the food web? Way at the top. You remove those orcas from the ecosystem and you completely change the ecosystem. That's tough. I mean, the question was, wouldn't a new species adopt that role?
I know there'd still be some of those top predators still there, but like in the event that they became extinct or whatever, wouldn't just the next line end up being like top in a way?
Okay, so what you'd end up having is, so what you're saying is, wouldn't this one now become the top level predator? And
there'd be a lot of these that would finish everything else alone.
you're going to screw everything up at every level. Yep. Right? Now, non-native species, we already talked about a bunch, over harvesting, and then just screwing up the systems. So how do we fix this? You know, this is what we're doing this month. Evaluating our lives and asking ourselves, what can we change to change the world? And you know, I get a little hippy dippy sometimes, but I mean, you know, evaluate what we're doing. What can I do to do it better? Right? Questions on anything? I'm gonna shut this down and I might play a quick introduction to a movie.